Prepare to have your perception of reality challenged as ordinary individuals share their extraordinary encounters with the unknown. These aren't tales spun from science fiction. These are first-hand accounts of chilling alien encounters told by those who have witnessed the inexplicable. Brace yourself for bone-chilling stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about our place in the universe.
This is probably the earliest reported alien encounter that I've come across on the internet. Back in 1896, a man was traveling to Lodi, California by horse and carriage when all of a sudden his horses got startled by something in the distance. The man said that he can see three strange beings on the side of the road. These odd looking creatures were very skinny and stood at about 7 feet tall. They were all bald except they had a velvet soft material that covered their entire body. They spoke in a strange language and they were holding a weird mineral that emitted a very bright light. The aliens tried to pick up the man, but he was too heavy for them. Eventually they moved away and they began to float above the ground. The man followed them and then he said that they floated into a huge, like cigar-shaped spaceship into the air and he never saw them again. Sounds to me like this guy's either seriously sleep deprived or he was definitely smoking something. A terrifying alien abduction breaks onto this list at number 9. Amy Rylance probably had the most terrifying moment of her life when she was apparently abducted by an alien back in October 2001. Her friend Petra woke up one night and saw Amy being carried in a sleeping position out through the window on a beam of light to a huge ship. It sounds to me like Petra probably took too many drugs that night, I don't know.
No, I don't drink, I don't take drugs at all. I'm just a normal person.
Well, there goes my theory. Petra ran to wake up Amy's husband, but by the time they made it back downstairs, Amy was gone. The curtain was ripped and the bushes outside of the window were burnt. They called the police, but they obviously didn't take them seriously because their story sounds absolutely insane. But before you write their story off, listen to this. Amy's husband received a call from a woman who lives 8 hours away. She said that she is with Amy at a hospital who is getting treatment for being dazed and dehydrated.
I have other marks from the tests that they did on me.
What sort of tests?
Just getting kind of DNA samples, and they didn't do anything bad to me, so it was wholly a good experience from my point of view.
No one has any logical explanation as to how she traveled such a far distance in such a short time frame. Amy said she remembers laying on a bed with tall figures leaning over her and then they were taking a bunch of samples. So I don't know what was going on. And now a river abduction comes in at number 8. In 1979, two co-workers were fishing off a pier when they heard a strange buzzing sound. When they took a look around, they saw a mysterious flashing blue lights. A UFO started to come down closer to them and 3 alien looking creatures dragged them on board of the spacecraft. Inside, the two co-workers were heavily examined for about 20 minutes before they were levitated back to the pier. After the incident, they ran to the police station to report what happened to them.
I was hunting a place to run, but it was nowhere to run. There was water in the front, water on the side, but immediately when they got a hold of us, I felt a little sharp something and they must have gave me a shot to relax me.
Calvin, sorry. We have to stop you for a second because this must have been absolutely terrifying. I mean, you're in a UFO with aliens and what are they doing to you? They're sort of giving you an MRI and examination. That's what you thought was happening.
Of course, no one believed them and they were just seen as two crazy people. And now at number 7, whether you call this one lucky or unlucky, we have the Clayton and Donna Lee abduction. A husband and wife from Texas are claiming that they have been abducted by aliens on multiple occasions, not just one time. They struck multiple times. Donna Lee reported that she was taken while she was pregnant and she lost her child due to the alien abduction. Maybe they took it? I don't know. Her husband Clayton said that they have been abducted numerous times throughout his life and he remembers his first abduction happened when he was a little boy at a park. He remembered floating into the sky and seeing stars and then complete darkness before he passed out. He even has a scar on his side and believes that it was caused by aliens who were attempting to take DNA samples from him.
Did you see the aliens?
Yes.
What did they look like? What I saw on that particular visit, they were tall, slender, blonde, looked human, but not human, not quite human. They didn't really use their voices to talk. For me, about being abducted is they bring me back. I'm here.
Well, maybe they won't someday, Donna. Maybe they'll take you to wherever they live.
They might not, but so far they have. So you can't live in that kind of fear and still have a life.
When was the last time?
Sounds like she enjoys being abducted. I don't know. A scary alien encounter brings us to number 6. Barney and Betty Hill were driving back to their house after they took a vacation in Niagara Falls. While driving, they saw a light in the sky that looked like it was getting closer to them. Eventually, it appeared as a huge shape hovering over their car. Barney got out and used his binoculars to look up above them. He was able to see 11 humanoid figures in shiny black uniforms and capes, and they were all watching them. If that was me, I'd race into my car and drive faster than Van Diesel and get the hell out of there. That's exactly what they tried to do, but they both said that they experienced a strange buzzing sensation, but they were able to make it back home alive. But they weren't untouched. Their clothes have been torn in strange places, and Betty found a strange pink residue on her dress. She also experienced really intense and vivid dreams about the experience, and she even remembers having skin samples taken from her and injections were put into her belly button. Here is an actual audio clip from a hypnosis session that the couple had after their encounter. Listen to this.
Alright, Captain, what is he? You're still asleep, but you can see it all clearly. Looks like a big pancake with windows. Get away from me!
Something very traumatic had happened to them.
The Travis Walton abduction story crashes onto this list at number 5. This story is actually really interesting. Let's travel back to November 1975, where 6 forestry workers in Arizona reported seeing their work colleague Travis Walton blasted through the air in a beam of light that came from a UFO. They called the police and reported him as missing, but during the investigation, the police suspected that the workers actually murdered Travis Walton and that they had disposed of the body. But this is where things get pretty interesting. 5 days later, Travis reappeared and he claimed that he was abducted by aliens. He said that he woke up on a table and he was surrounded by small figures in orange gowns. Maybe he woke up in a prison. I don't know. Maybe there is an answer for that. Well, he said that their skin was very smooth, but it was chalky, and their bald heads were too big for their bodies. He managed to escape from the aliens, but he went into a room that had humans in it, but they were dressed in blue uniforms. This makes it seem like more of a prison. Well, they never spoke to him, but they captured him and put a gas mask on him, and he lost consciousness. But he does remember waking up confused on a strange road in Arizona. A strange alien abduction case is at number 4. Hillary Porter is known as the woman who has been abducted by aliens more times than she can count.
And you believe that you may have something inside your right ear.
Yes, definitely.
Explain.
A little bit like a telescope. It's got 3 sections, yes. Very, very minute. Then the rest goes down into my flesh, into the ear. Okay. And this thing sometimes comes right out to the very edge. It depends what I'm doing. It seems like it.
You sometimes feel it moving.
Oh, yeah, you got that feel, and it's slightly longer some days and retracts a tiny bit. And then it was like I was just laying down to go to sleep, and like a little voice came from it and said, "Good night."
Okay.
Okay, how creepy would that be? The first encounter that she remembers was when she was like 5 years old and she was playing behind her home. She said that she remembers seeing a reptile looking alien standing in front of her. It had scaly skin, black holes on the nose, and a little mouth. She said that the creature grabbed her arms and pulled her underneath a disc that was located in the fields. They performed a ton of painful tests on her, and then they let her go hours later. She said that she'd been abducted a bunch of times and she actually suffered from migraines and feels really sick. Sometimes she even wakes up with fresh scars or bruises, or there are bloody marks and stains on her clothes or bed sheets. Okay, a bizarre alien abduction takes us to number 3. Back in October 1957, a man named Antonio Boris claimed that he saw a red star in the sky. The light traveled closer to him until Antonio was able to see that it was a frickin' spaceship. It landed on its 3 legs in the nearby field. Antonio tried to escape on his tractor, and he was grabbed by a strange creature with big blue eyes. He claimed that he was taken aboard of the spaceship where he was covered by a gel-like substance, and that's so that they can crossbreed. Eventually he was taken off to the ship and he landed on Earth 4 hours later. He was taken to a hospital where they found burns on his body and lesions. He also felt nauseous and had extremely severe headaches. The doctor later diagnosed him as suffering from radiation sickness. We have another disturbing alien encounter, and this brings us to number 2. Peter Corey remembers one night back in 1988 as the day that he was abducted by aliens. He was laying in his bed when all of a sudden he felt something grab him by his ankle. He instantly felt pins and needles, and then he couldn't feel his body anymore. He was paralyzed. When he woke up, he saw 3 strange looking creatures around his bed just staring at him. They had gold skin with tiny slits for mouths. They had large black eyes, and he said that they can tell that the aliens communicated telepathically. They inserted a needle into his skull and then he just blacked out. If you thought that was bad, his second alien encounter was even worse. He said that the female aliens with long white hair appeared over his bed and they tried to mate with him. After the encounter, he saw lots of white hairs on his bed, so he had the DNA analyzed and it was confirmed that this hair was biologically different from human hair. I can't even deal with this story, so let's move on. The abduction of Jesse Long tops this list at number 1. This alien encounter is probably the most popular story out there, so some of you guys might have heard of it. Jesse was just 5 years old when he claimed that he was abducted by aliens for the first time. He said that he was exploring the woods with his brother when all of a sudden they found a round structure in a clearing. A tall, mysterious figure approached the boys and paralyzed them. Jesse said that he remembers being taken to a spacecraft and placed onto a cold table where he felt his legs being poked and prodded by the tall figures. Over the years, Jesse said that he had been abducted many times. He said that he was being constantly experimented on, and they even took sperm samples that they used to crossbreed with a female alien.
Placed on a table, I was presented with a baby, was told, "This is your child."
I don't know about you guys, but that is probably the most disturbing story I've ever heard of. I'm actually so terrified. I really hope that aliens don't come find me if they're actually out there somewhere.
Number 10. Antonio Villas-Boas. On October 16th, 1957, at night, Antonio Villas-Boas was plowing fields when he saw what he described as a red star in the night sky that approached him, growing in size. The craft began descending to land on the field, and he decided to leave. Smart choice. He first attempted to leave the scene on his tractor, but its lights and engine died, so he decided to continue on foot. However, he was seized by a 5-foot-tall humanoid who was wearing gray coveralls and a helmet. Its eyes were small and blue, and instead of speech, it made noises like barks or yelps. 3 similar beings then joined and they dragged him to inside their craft. Once inside the craft, Antonio said he was stripped of his clothes and covered from head to toe with a strange gel. He was then led into a large semicircular room through a doorway that had strange red symbols written all over it. They then took blood from him and took him to a 3rd room where some kind of gas was pumped into the room, which made him violently ill. Shortly after this, Antonio was joined in the room by another humanoid. This one, however, was female, very attractive, and naked, so the two had sexual intercourse. Antonio was then given back his clothing and taken on a tour of the ship by the humanoids. He was then escorted off the ship and watched as it took off, glowing brightly. When he returned home, he had discovered that 4 hours had passed. Wow. Number 9. Barney and Betty Hill. The UFO sighting happened about 10:30 p.m. September 19th, 1961. Barney and Betty were driving, and Betty saw a bright point of light in the sky, and they stopped to take a look. Through binoculars, Barney saw what he reasoned was a commercial airliner, but soon changed his mind because without looking as if it had turned, the craft rapidly descended in his direction. They quickly returned to the car, and the couple watched as silent, illuminated craft moved erratically quickly and bounced back and forth in the night sky. The object rapidly descended towards their vehicle, causing Barney to stop in the middle of the highway. The huge silent craft hovered about 80 to 100 feet above their car. Using the binoculars, Barney claimed to have seen 8 to 11 humanoid figures who were peering out of the craft's windows, seemingly to look at him. One figure continued to look at Barney and communicated a message telling him to stay where you are and looking. Barney said they were wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps. He drove away and they heard a rhythmic series of beeping or buzzing sounds. The car vibrated and a tingling sensation passed through their bodies, and they experienced the onset of an altered state of consciousness that left their mind dulled. A second series of beeping or buzzing sounds returned the couple to full consciousness. They found that they had traveled nearly 35 miles or 56 kilometers, but had only vague, spotty memories of this section of the road. Number 8. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. The Pascagoula abduction was a UFO sighting and alien abduction in 1973, which Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker claimed they were abducted by aliens while fishing near Pascagoula, Mississippi. On the evening of October 11th, 1973, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker told the Jackson County, Mississippi Sheriff's Office they were fishing off a pier. They heard a whirling/whizzing sound, saw 2 flashing blue lights, observed an oval-shaped object 30 to 40 feet across and 8 to 10 feet high. They claimed that they were conscious but paralyzed, while 3 creatures with robotic slit mouths and crab-like pincers took them aboard the object and subjected them to an examination. Number 7. Demi Lovato. Yes, that Demi Lovato, the singer, songwriter, and actress. Demi claims they were abducted by 3 space aliens and taken to a pink and purple planet. Demi appeared on the Kelly Clarkson show and said, "I woke up in my room and there were 3 beings. They asked, 'Do you want to see your planet?' I whooshed out of the room, I hovered before our planet, then whooshed to this pink and purple planet." Now, some people are skeptical she made this up to promote her limited series streaming on Peacock, Unidentified with Demi Lovato, but if it is true, what an experience. Number 6. Audrey and Debbie Hewins. Twins Audrey and Debbie Hewins said they were abducted by aliens. "I was probably about 5 years old or so," said Audrey, "and bright blue light would come into the room and the door would open and there would be like a foggy kind of misty blue light just shining through the whole house. And these 2 figures would come in. We have been up in crafts and seen our house from above. They are very good at money racing or whatever you want to call it. They'll leave you with bits and pieces of things you can remember." Debbie added, "I remember one time being on a spaceship and standing there on the spaceship and the floor and the walls disappeared. They started doing all kinds of experiments on us when we were 12. She was initially hesitant to come forward, and Audrey claimed that after a non-human entity saved her from drowning in the ocean, she was inspired to dedicate her life to openly discussing her alien abduction experiences. Number 5. Thomas Reed. On September 1st, 1969, Thomas Reed and his family in Berkshire County, Massachusetts saw a UFO. In the car with his mother, brother, and grandmother that night, the family noticed a group of glowing orbs dash out the roadside trees. "It came to a stop off the right side of the road," Thomas said. "Eventually, everything got really calm. It was like being in the middle of a hurricane. It was just dead silence. Then there was an eruption of crickets and frogs and it got really loud and that was it. Then the family suddenly found itself back in the car. But they had inexplicably lost 2 hours of memory. Stranger still, Reed's mother and grandmother had somehow switched car seats. He said over time the family regained some memory of the incident, including having been to a hangar-like facility with other people. We encountered something, it was definitely not of this world. The hangar thing we were in was huge, it was larger than a football field. The hallway we had seen was circular with a Y configuration, almost to control the flow of traffic, and this one room had a bowed-in wall that was rounded." Number 4. Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber has written fiction for more than 40 years, and he said his writing streak was interrupted one night in the late 80s by an alien abduction in upstate New York. The alleged incident occurred on the night of December 26, 1985 as Whitley slept alone in his cabin in the woods. Woken by a strange noise, he saw a small, non-human entity approaching his bed. Suddenly, it was morning. According to him, beings that he has since referred to as visitors entered his home and abducted him. He also detailed another alien encounter that he claims took place in Toronto. Asleep in his Delta Chelsea hotel room in the middle of the night on June 6, 1998, Whitley claimed to have been visited by another mysterious stranger. I got up to open the door, thinking it was a room service waiter. It was not. It was a man described as 5'1.5 feet tall, older looking, like someone in his 70s. He wore dark colored clothing, a turtleneck, and charcoal slacks. He claimed the visitor stood motionless by his window for nearly an hour, expounding on the dangers of creating an intelligence more evolved than its creator. He said it was the most extraordinary conversation I have ever had in my entire life. Number 3. Frederick Valentich. On October 21st, 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentich disappeared into thin air. At 7:06 p.m., while at 4,500 feet, after departing, he reported that an unidentified craft was following him. Melbourne Flight Service insisted that there was no traffic near him, but the pilot was adamant. He explained that it had 4 bright lights and suddenly passed 1,000 feet above him at remarkable speed. For 5 straight minutes, Frederick described its movements and shiny metallic exterior. Suddenly, he experienced engine trouble and said that the aircraft was hovering and that it's not an aircraft. Then they never heard from him again. The last sound radio officials heard was a metallic scraping sound. Authorities presumed he had crashed, but a later search of the area yielded nothing. In 2014, a UFO action group in Victoria alleged that a farmer observed a UFO nearly 90 feet in length hovering above his farm the morning following Frederick's disappearance. The farmer also claimed that the pilot's plane was stuck to the UFO, leaking oil. While the farmer said he scratched the airplane's registration number on his tractor, he never came forward. Ultimately, only a few possibilities regarding the disappearance of Frederick Valentich exist: that he crashed and his remains were never recovered, that he purposely disappeared, or, of course, that he was abducted by aliens. Number 2. Terrell Copeland. The Virgin pilot Terrell Copeland claimed that he was abducted by aliens, particularly because he was a Marine. Terrell claimed that his first experience with aliens occurred in 2007 when he captured footage of what he believed to be a UFO on his cell phone from his apartment in Suffolk, Virginia. It was an orb of light, just a big ball of light. It wasn't moving, one was solid white, the other was directly across the street from it, up 300 feet above ground, and was changing colors very rapidly, he said. He alleged that it wasn't until after he published the footage online that things truly became strange. I woke up from a nap by the sound of someone trying to enter my apartment, and I said, "Who is it?" There was no answer. You can see the doorknob moving and scratching at the door. I keep a firearm, it was on my table, and my thought was to get up and check. Despite the urge to get up, Terrell was paralyzed and only able to move his eyes. Suddenly, he heard a voice through the door tell him, "You don't need that weapon. We won't harm." He then began to experience missing hours as well. He was incapable of accounting for waking hours during a span of 2 nights. I was in a room and I saw a woman who did not have a complete human features. She had the typical black eyes that you hear about. She had an elongated skull, and that startled me. And the next memory I have is me standing on my balcony waving at this cylinder-shaped ship, he said. And coming in at number 1 is Travis Walton. On November 5th, 1975, Travis Walton was abducted by aliens and didn't return for 5 whole days. Travis's abduction began after working in Sitgreaves National Forest near Heber, Arizona. Travis and a 6-man group of vloggers were returning home when they allegedly spotted a shiny disc spanning 40 feet in diameter hovering in the sky above them. He said it was a metallic, glowing disc making some very strange sound. The closer I got to it, the more scared we all got, and they were swearing at me to get away from there, and when I got up close, it suddenly got louder and started to move. Travis then claimed that non-human beings abducted him and experimented on him until he fought them off. But as the beings poked and prodded at him on a kind of table, 5 days elapsed on Earth where Walton was officially declared missing. I became conscious in the aircraft, and I believed I was in the hospital. I was in a lot of pain, and as I became more conscious, I looked around and saw alien beings, and I just panicked. They were much smaller than me, and I think that's the reason they gave up. Once they found out they couldn't control me, they split. Later research conducted on the site of Travis's abduction showed an unusual growth rate in the trees where the craft had allegedly hovered. The trees near the site were found to be producing wood fiber at a rate 36 times greater than they had decades before. Starting off this countdown, we have the disappearing Air Force jet. Over the years, a number of military officials have disappeared while exploring UFOs. Take this case, for example. On November 23, 1953, the U.S. Air Defense Command noticed a blip on their radar in a restricted airspace over Lake Superior. Since it was in restricted space, an Air Force jet took off to investigate. There were 2 crew members on board. The men never returned home from the mission. So while out investigating the blip, they got right to the spot where it should be. On the radar, it showed that they were right on top of this blip, but they couldn't see a craft anywhere. Then ground control saw the blip veer off and vanish, as did the men inside of the jet. The United States Air Force, US Coast Guard, and Canadian Air Forces all conducted an extensive search and rescue to try and find the men, but this was sadly unsuccessful. In fact, they didn't even find signs of wreckage. To this day, no one knows what happened to the mysterious UFO, the men, or their jet. Moving on at number 9, we have the Tehran UFO. In the early hours on September 19, 1976, a shiny object was reported hovering in the skies above Tehran by at least 4 different people. As a result, 2 Imperial Iranian Air Force F-4 Phantom II jets set off to explore this mystery object. However, while nearing this object, their craft began to fail. They were going to open fire on it, but their weapons system was down. Not only that, but officers described the light as, and I quote, flashing with intense red, green, orange, and blue lights, so bright that I was not able to see its body. What's weird is that as soon as their jets moved away from the craft, their systems returned to normal. He then watched the craft, and I quote, slow down and land gently on the ground, radiating a high, bright light. The next day, they explored the area where the craft landed, and a number of residents said that they heard a loud noise and a bright flash of light during the night. In our 8th spot, we have the 6 soldiers. This next UFO encounter took place in North Korea in 1951 during the Korean War and impacted a number of Korean soldiers. So in May of 1951, Korean soldiers were preparing to bomb a nearby village when they were greeted by a strange craft. According to the men, the craft emitted some form of a ray that made their airburst start to explode. One man then said that they were attacked by some ray that was emitting pulses. Like a lighthouse light, you could see when it was aimed directly at you and when it wasn't. Well, after this weird attack, the men were left sick and had to be taken to the hospital. Some say that they were attacked by a UFO. Others say that they were attacked by some sort of death ray. To this day, we still don't know what attacked them and what caused them to fall so ill. Moving on at number 7, we have Skinwalker Ranch. Now this place has been known to be filled with supernatural activity. Not only do evil shape-shifting entities roam the land, but apparently aliens and UFOs do too. According to the original owner, Terry Sherman, him and his wife had a number of chilling experiences there. This ultimately led to them selling his plot of land. For starters, in June of 1996, mysterious crop circles kept appearing. Then, on a number of occasions, they saw UFOs hovering around their property. The worst is when they kept finding their cattle completely mutilated. This was not done by an animal, as it was done without bloodshed, and the cuts were very precise. For years, the government and military have been exploring Skinwalker Ranch to try and make sense of this situation. But they haven't, honestly. In our 6th spot, we have Falcon Lake. This incident has been named one of the most famous Canadian UFO encounters. It all started on May 20th, 1967, when 2 glowing objects descended from the sky near Falcon Lake in Manitoba. This was witnessed by a man named Stefan Michalak. Apparently, one of the weird crafts landed close to him, so he decided to investigate, like a dummy, which was a terrible idea. When he got close to it, it suddenly shot back into the sky. The beam of light from the craft as it took off set Stefan's clothes on fire. He was left with a bunch of strange burns on his body, including burn marks on his chest and a pattern of dots. Following the encounter, he fell ill. Now, some people believe the story to be a hoax, but he literally has burn marks on his body and scorched clothes as proof. So it makes you think otherwise. You're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the 2 fishermen. On October 11th, 1973, 2 friends, Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson, decided to go out fishing on a river in Mississippi.
That's when a big bright light came out of nowhere. Parker reported, and I quote, "It was a blinding light. It was hard to tell with the light so bright, but it looked like it was shaped like a football. I would say, just estimating, that it was about 80 foot. It made very little sound, and it was just a hissing noise." But it gets weirder. He then claims that 3 legless creatures came out of the vessel and towards the two. They described them as having mitten-shaped claws. One was necklace and gray, the other was more feminine. The friends started to freak out, and that's when these creatures wrapped their hands around their neck. Upon doing so, they calmed down. Parker thinks that they were injected with something, and that's why they immediately calmed down. After that, he claims that they went on board the vessel and were experimented on. When they got out of there, they alerted the police, who alerted the military. In fact, the 2 men were interrogated a number of times because of how wild their story was. Moving on to number 4, we have the mutilated sergeant. This story is one that genuinely freaks me out. So back in 1956, an American Air Force Sergeant, Jonathan P. Leavitt, and Major William Cunningham were out collecting the debris from a recent missile launch in New Mexico. While doing so, the 2 separated and decided to go their own ways. After a while, Major William heard his sergeant let out a loud scream. As he rushed towards him, he saw the sergeant being lifted up by a UFO, then pulled him inside the craft before zooming away. When his colleagues found William, he was in complete shock from what he had saw, and he was taken to the hospital. Of course, no one believed him. They were like, there's no way that he was abducted by a UFO, okay. But after researching, they did find that an unidentified object was present on their radar at the time of the abduction. Now, what happened to the abducted man? Well, 3 days later, his body was found 10 miles away. It was severely mutilated and drained of blood. Isn't that freaky? So it seems like he was literally abducted by aliens and then they killed and ate him or something. What makes this even more suspicious is that the government reports on this just suddenly vanished into thin air. Moving on to number 3, we have pilot Frederick Valentic. On October 21st, 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentic was partaking in a 125 nautical mile training flight when he disappeared into thin air. Now, it's important to note that Frederick was a very experienced pilot. So around 7:06 p.m. that night, he radioed his crew saying that an unidentified craft was following him. He described it as having 4 bright lights with a shiny metallic exterior. His final words were, "It is hovering and it's not an aircraft." Then his signal cut out. Frederick or his craft were never seen again. Now, many people believe that he was shot down or abducted by a UFO. In fact, an unidentified farmer in the area said that he saw a UFO nearly 90 feet in length hovering above his farm. He saw this during the morning of Frederick's disappearance. He then said that he also saw a plane stuck to the UFO leaking oil. Moving on to number 2, we have Terrell Copeland. In 2007, former United States Marine Terrell Copeland had his first experience with an alien. He was in his apartment when he saw an orb of light outside. He said, and I quote, "It was just a big ball of light. It wasn't moving. One was solid white, the other was directly across the street from it, up 300 feet above ground, and was changing colors very rapidly. The next thing he remembers is feeling as though something was wrong and he passed out. When he woke up, he heard someone entering his apartment. The person was moving the doorknob and scratching at the door trying to get in. He tried getting up from his bed, but he was completely paralyzed. He tried to reach for a weapon that he had, but that's when he heard a voice through the door tell him, 'You don't need that weapon. We won't harm.' When he finally was able to move, he lost 4 hours of his time. He believes that he was abducted by aliens. He said that he remembers being in a room with a woman who was definitely not human. He said, and I quote, "She had the typical black eyes you hear about. She had an elongated skull, and that startled me. And the next memory I have is me standing on my balcony waving at this cylinder-shaped ship." That's freaky. Do any of you guys have a good alien abduction story? Let me know in the comments below. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the Boy Scouts. On August 19th, 1952, a Scoutmaster and his Boy Scouts were on their way home from a retreat when they encountered a bright flash near West Palm Beach, Florida. The Scouts master originally thought it was a downed plane or a car accident, so he pulled over and got out to help. He told the Scouts to stay in the car and alert someone if he didn't return in 15 minutes. So he got out with his flashlight and an axe and went towards where he saw the bright lights. This ended up taking him to a wooded area. About 4 minutes in, he started to smell something very nauseating. Then he felt like he was being watched by somebody. The next thing he remembers is feeling heat on the top of his body. He looked up and saw a hovering, glowing object above him. He started to back away from the craft when he heard a noise like metal against metal. A hatch then opened and he saw a red flare come out towards him. The next thing he knew, he was unconscious. When he awoke, he was leaning against a tree but was completely blind. His eyes had been burned by the light. When authorities found him, he was incoherent, terrified, and freaking out. Stories like this trip me out because, like, if it wasn't an alien or a UFO, then what was it, you know?
Coming in at number 10 is Antonio Villas-Boas. On the night of October 16th, 1957, Antonio Villas-Boas was plowing fields when he saw what he described as a red star in the night sky that approached him, growing in size. The craft began descending to land in the field, and he decided to leave on his tractor, but its lights and engine died, so he decided to continue on foot. However, he was seized by a 5-foot-tall humanoid who was wearing gray coveralls and a helmet. Its eyes were small and blue, and instead of speech, it made noises like barks or yelps. 3 similar beings then joined and dragged him inside their aircraft. Once inside the craft, Antonio said he was stripped of his clothes and covered from head to toe with a strange gel. He was then led to a large semicircular room through a doorway that had strange red symbols written over it. They then took blood from him and took him to a third room where some kind of gas was pumped into the room, which made him violently ill. Shortly after this, Antonio was joined in the room by another humanoid. This one, however, was female, very attractive. Antonio was then given back his clothing and taken on a tour of the ship by the humanoids. He was then escorted off the ship and watched as it took off, glowing brightly. When he returned home, he discovered that only 4 hours had passed. Now, did he help create one of the first alien-human hybrids? I think so. Number 9, Elizabeth Clarer. Elizabeth Clarer was a South African woman who, starting in 1956, publicly claimed to have been contacted by aliens multiple times between 1954 and 1963. Her first visitation supposedly occurred when she was just 7 years old, and she was one of the first women to claim relationship with an extraterrestrial. She promoted an idea of a better world and beliefs in a cosmic consciousness. In her book Beyond the Light Barrier, she strived to convey a message of peace, love, understanding, and environmentalism, which she credited to the superior wisdom of an advanced and immaculately utopian Venusian civilization. She also ended up promoting conspiracy theories of an international cover-up that kept vital information from the public and claimed to have been threatened with abduction to press her to revealing details about alien technology. Number 8, Terrell Copeland. The Virginia pilot Terrell Copeland claimed that he was abducted by aliens, particularly because he was a Marine. Terrell claimed that his first experience with aliens occurred in 2007 when he captured footage of what he believed to be a UFO on his cell phone from his apartment in Suffolk, Virginia. It was an orb of light, just a big ball of light. It wasn't moving, it was solid white. The other was directly across the street from it, up 300 feet above the ground, and was changing colors very rapidly, he said. He alleged that it wasn't until after he published the footage online that things truly became strange. I woke up from a nap by the sound of someone trying to enter my apartment, and I said, "Who is it?" There was no answer. You could see the doorknob moving and scratching at the door. The firearm, it was on my table, and my thought was to get up and check. Despite the urge to get up, Terrell was paralyzed and only able to move his eyes. Suddenly, he heard a voice through the door tell him, "You don't need that weapon, we won't harm." He then began to experience missing hours as well, and he was incapable of accounting for 4 waking hours during a span of 2 nights. I was in a room and I saw a woman who did not have complete human features. She had the typical black eyes that you hear about, she had an elongated skull, and that startled me. The next memory I have is me standing on my balcony waving at this cylinder-shaped ship, he said. Number 7, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. The Pescalua abduction was a UFO sighting and alien abduction in 1973, in which Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker claimed they were abducted by aliens while fishing in Mississippi. On the evening of October 11, 1973, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker told the Jackson County, Mississippi Sheriff's Office that they were fishing off a pier on the west bank of the river when they heard a whirling whiz sound, saw 2 flashing blue lights, and observed an oval-shaped object 30 to 40 feet across 8 to 10 feet high. They claimed that they were conscious but paralyzed, while 3 creatures with robotic slit mouths and crab-like pincers took them aboard the object and subjected them to an examination. Number 6. Thomas Reed. On September 1st, 1969, Thomas Reed and his family in Berkshire County, Massachusetts saw a UFO. In the car with his mother, brother, and grandmother that night, the family noticed a group of glowing orbs dash out of the roadside trees. It came to a stop off the right side of the road, Thomas said. Everything got really calm. It was like being in the middle of a hurricane. It was just like dead silent. Then there was an eruption of crickets and frogs, and it got really loud, and that was it. Then the family suddenly found itself back in the car, but they had inexplicably lost 2 hours of memory. Stranger still, Thomas's mother and grandmother had somehow switched car seats. He said over time the family regained some memory of the incident, including having been to a hangar-like facility with other people. We encountered something. It was definitely not of this world. The hangar thing we were in was huge. It was larger than a football field. The hallway we had seen was circular with a Y configuration, almost to control the flow of traffic, and this one room had a bowed-in wall that was round, he said. Number 5. Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber had written fiction for more than 40 years, and he said his writing streak was interrupted one night in the late 80s by an alien abduction in upstate New York. The alleged incident occurred on the night of December 26, 1985, as Whitley slept alone in his cabin in the woods. Woken by a strange noise, he saw a small non-human entity approaching his bed. Then suddenly it was morning. According to him, beings that he has since referred to as visitors entered his home and abducted him. Now, he also detailed another alien encounter that he claims took place in Toronto. Asleep in his Delta Chelsea hotel room in the middle of the night on June 6, 1998, Whitley claimed to have been visited by another mysterious stranger. I got up to open the door thinking it was a room service waiter. It was not. It was a man I described as about 5.5 feet tall, older looking, like someone in his 70s. He wore dark-colored clothing, a turtleneck, and charcoal slacks. He claimed the visitor stood motionless by the window for nearly an hour, expounding on the dangers of creating an intelligence more involved than its creator. He said it was the most extraordinary conversation I've ever had in my life. Number 4. Frederick Valentich. On October 21st, 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentich disappeared into thin air. At 7:06 p.m., while at 4,500 feet, after departing, he reported that an unidentified craft was following him. Melbourne Flight Service insisted that there was no traffic near him, but the pilot was adamant. He explained that it had 4 bright lights and suddenly passed 1,000 feet above him at a remarkable speed. For 5 straight minutes, Frederick described its movements and shiny metallic exterior. Suddenly, he experienced engine trouble and said the aircraft was hovering and it's not an aircraft. Then they never heard from him again. The last sound radio officials heard was a metallic scraping sound. Now, authorities presume that he had crashed, but a later search of the area yielded nothing. In 2014, a UFO action group in Victoria alleged that a farmer observed a UFO nearly 90 feet in length hovering above his farm on the morning following Frederick's disappearance. The farmer also claimed that the pilot's plane was stuck to the UFO, leaking oil. But again, Frederick and the plane have never been found. Ultimately, a few possibilities regarding the disappearance of Frederick exist: that he crashed and his remains were never covered, that he purposely disappeared, or, of course, he was abducted by aliens. Number 3. Audrey and Debbie Hewins. Twins Audrey and Debbie Hewins said they were abducted by aliens. I was probably about 5 years old or so, said Audrey, and a bright blue light would come into the room and the door would open, and there would be like a foggy kind of misty blue light just shining through the whole house, and these 2 figures would come in. We have been up in crafts and seen our house from above. They're very good at mind erasing, or whatever you want to call it. They'll leave you with bits and pieces of things that you can remember. Debbie added, I remember one time being on a spaceship and standing there on the spaceship and the floor and the walls disappeared. They started doing all kinds of experiments on us when we were 12. While she was initially hesitant to come forward, Audrey claimed that after a non-human entity saved her life from drowning in the ocean, she was inspired to dedicate her life to openly discussing her alien abduction experiences. Number 2. Travis Walton. On November 5th, 1975, Travis Walton was abducted by aliens and he didn't return for 5 whole days. Travis's abduction began after working at the Site Graves National Forest near Heber, Arizona. Travis and a 6-man group of loggers were returning home when they allegedly spotted a shiny disc spanning 40 feet in diameter hovering in the sky above them. He said it was a metallic glowing disc making some very strange sounds. The closer I got to it, the more scared we all got, and they were swearing at me to get away from there, and when I got up close, it suddenly got louder and started to move. Travis then claimed that non-human beings abducted him and experimented on him until he fought them off. But as the being supposedly poked and prodded at him on a kind of table, 5 days elapsed on Earth where Walton was officially declared missing. I became conscious inside the craft, and I believe I was in the hospital. I was in a lot of pain, and as I became more conscious, I looked around and saw alien beings, and I just panicked. They were much smaller than me, and I think that's the reason why they gave up. Once they found out they couldn't control me, they split. Now, later research conducted at the site of Travis's abduction showed an unusual growth rate in the trees where the craft had allegedly hovered. The trees near the site were found to be producing wood fiber at a rate of 36 times greater than they had been in the decades before. And coming in number 1 is Dr. Albert Bender. One of the most famous instances of alien invasion was the case of Dr. Albert Bender. Albert was a very intelligent researcher with an interest in aliens and UFOs, and even founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau. It was successful as he began to gather lots of alleged evidence related to UFOs, but soon he began seeing strange men watching him around his town, reportedly with glowing eyes. Then one night in 1953, 3 men in black showed up to his house. The mysterious men looked at first to be government agents, but he soon discovered they were something from a completely different realm. The men made it clear to Albert that he was to immediately stop all UFO research and investigation and to cease any publishing. They then confiscated most of his findings before threatening him once more and vanishing. Then he had a second encounter where he was visited by 3 shadowy figures. They did not touch the floor but hovered above it, and they told him that their human appearance was an illusion and that whatever information he told people about their visitation would not be believed. They supposedly told him that they capture people from Earth and use their bodies to disguise themselves. Now, due to all this, Albert was so afraid of the experience that he immediately halted all publishings, quit ufology, and turned into a completely different man. Years later, he published a book about his experience with the men in black and went on to manage a motel and never touched extraterrestrial research ever again.
Starting off this countdown, we have Leah Haley. In 1990, a woman named Leah Haley was randomly abducted by aliens. She remembers being on a spacecraft in a round room surrounded by bright lights. When she woke up, she found herself lying on her back on an examination table. Weird alien-type figures surrounded her. Later, she decided to undergo hypnosis to try and remember more information about her abduction. And that's when she realized that the military might have had something to do with this. She also started to remember fellow abductees who she later would meet in real life. When Leah started to say that the military was involved in her abduction, she was actually abducted by members of the US military and interrogated. They apparently told her not to tell anyone or else they would kill her. Then over the years, she was offered jobs randomly by total strangers for positions at nearby military bases. So she believes that she was chosen by the military for a reason. Although the military threatened her in 1992, she published a book titled Lost Was the Key, and it's all about her alien abduction experience. Coming in at number 9, we have Myrna Hansen. In 1980, a mother named Myrna Hansen and her 6-year-old son Sean were headed home from Oklahoma when they approached a pasture. That's when all of a sudden they saw a beam shoot down from the sky and drag cows up into the air. When the UFO realized that Hansen and her son witnessed this, they abducted them. Through hypnosis, she was able to remember being taken to a deep underground military base. In fact, she was able to describe its location in great detail, to the point where members of the Air Force office started following her and her son around. Clearly, they were scared that she was onto them. Moving on to number 8, we have the member of the military. So in 1982, a man whose name was concealed for protection purposes was stationed on a military base in New Brunswick. Let's just call him Steven. So one night, Steven's friend and girlfriend left the base to go watch Tron in theaters. An hour later, they were back already. Their car had been smashed. Apparently, they were driving along a stretch of the highway to the movies when they saw a bunch of strange lights coming over a hill. A bunch of cars pulled over to check out the lights, including this dude and his girlfriend. That's when they saw a large disc with flashing lights fly up into the sky. Everyone ran back to get into their car and to drive away. As they were driving away, the craft crashed into the side of some cars, including these guys. A few days later, men in black showed up at the base looking for Steven and his friend. They told them that they better keep their mouths shut and to never tell anyone if they wanted to keep their military careers. Moving on to number 7, we have Robert Richardson. In 1967 in Ohio, Robert Richardson collided with a UFO while driving. However, after impact, the object disappeared without a trace. The only thing they left behind was a small lump of metal from their craft. A week later, he was visited by 2 men in black suits who told him to cough up the piece of metal he collected from the scene of the crash, which was hella sketchy because number 1, how did they know about the accident? And number 2, how did they know that he picked up this piece of metal? Richardson said that he gave the metal to the authorities for testing. The men told him if he was lying, they would kill his wife. Thankfully, he never heard from these men again. In our 6th spot, we have the abductee named Linda. One day, a woman named Linda Napolitano woke up floating mid-air above her bed. She looked around and saw some strange figures by her bed watching her. The next thing she remembers is being on board a craft where these figures were experimenting on her. Some of them looked like aliens, others were humans. Eventually, Linda decided to come forward about her experience and share it with the public. But upon doing so, 2 men kidnapped and interrogated her multiple times. This led her to believe that her abductions were either planned by the government, which makes sense as to why she saw both alien figures and human figures, or the military knows that aliens are real and are trying to learn more about them through the abductees. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Melinda Leslie. Melinda Leslie from Orange County, California, leads a support group for alien abductees. More than 3 dozen of her attendees say that they have been taken aboard an alien spacecraft and then later have been re-abducted by apparent military personnel and then subjected to physical examinations and interrogations. She herself has been a victim of this. She remembers humans in a flying triangle abducting her and taking her to an underground testing facility. There, a number of men in hazmat suits ran extensive tests on her. Eventually, she was abducted a second time, this time by a red-haired military captain who told her to tell him everything she knew about aliens. Coming in at number 4, we have the Roswell UFO. Roswell, New Mexico is famous for their UFO sightings. This is the hotspot for aliens, apparently. Or maybe it's because the military has a secret underground alien base there. Well, in 1947, a rancher named W.W. Mac Brazel said he found wreckage on his big plot of land. In fact, during that time, there were a number of UFO sightings, so the rancher thought that the wreckage was from a UFO crash. So he brought that material to the sheriff, who brought it to an officer from the US Army Air Force. Later, the US Army announced that what the rancher found was a flying disc. But the following day, the US military quickly backtracked. And they were like, no, it's not a UFO. It's actually just, debris from a weather balloon. Then, years later in 1994, they admitted that the weather balloon story was completely bogus. Now, this isn't exactly an alien abduction story, but it's a real story of the military caught lying and covering up their tracks. Moving on to number 3, we have the cornfield. This next story comes from a man who grew up on a cornfield. Their name was never released due to privacy reasons, but for our sake, let's just call him Bob. So one night, Bob saw something fly down from the sky and hover right above their farm. It was shaped like a rectangle and it was glowing light. Then it left as fast as it came. The next day, Bob and his family were greeted by 2 men in black suits with dark sunglasses. They said they needed to inspect the farm because there was a supposed natural gas leak. It was very strange because mostly everything on the farm was run by solar energy. Alas, the men were from the government, so Bob was like, okay, "Your authority, you know best, knock your socks off." The men then went out to the area where the UFO had been the night prior. Now, Bob did tell the men what he had seen. The two men said that if he ever repeated that, he was going to be arrested for endangering people. Like, what is going on, and why is the military so sus? In our second spot, we have the test subject. Ever since Caitlin was younger, she remembers being abducted by aliens. At first, she thought she just had a wild imagination as a kid or was a vivid dreamer. That was until she was abducted again when she was an adult. She remembers being taken from her bed by weird men, and then waking up on an examination table surrounded by bright lights. She could not move or scream. She knew she had been drugged. The next thing she remembers is feeling something really hot on her face. The men around her were doing something to her face. Months later, she decided to share her story with the world. And immediately upon doing so, she was visited by two strange men who told her she better tell the press everything she was saying was made up, or else she would pay the consequences. Fearing for her life, Caitlin refused to talk about her story to anyone ever again, and declined any follow-up interviews. And in our number one spot today, we have Kendall Folk. Kendall is another woman who has been abducted a number of times throughout her life. At first, she thought these abductions were by real aliens. Later, she was able to debunk her own abductions and realize the truth. Kendall believes that she was targeted by the military due to her mental health issues. This makes her an easy target in their eyes because, sadly, people will find it harder to validate her claims. She remembers during one abduction, she was taken from her home in a UFO craft. Later, she was able to remember that it was a car that pulled into her driveway, not a UFO. She remembers standing in her driveway and seeing this alien get out of the car and come towards her. Now she remembers how weird this alien was. It walked very robotic. And she believes that that's because it was in fact a robot. The military used this so that Kendall would think it was a real alien abduction. They later took her and brought her back to a facility where tests were done on her. This is absolutely wild. Is it true? Is the military faking alien abductions just to run tests on us? This is mind-blowing.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have the red light. This one comes from Reddit user Nihilistic Dawn. One night a few years ago, he went with his friend as he drove his girlfriend back. They decided to take the long way home as they drove along a deserted back road. He began to zone out. He was staring at a blinking red light off in the distance and thought to himself, I wonder why they built a cell phone tower all the way out here. Suddenly, the light blinked and was a lot closer than it was a moment earlier. His friend stopped the car and pointed out the red light. It blinked again and then was directly in front of them. The red glow was so bright it flooded the entire car in a deep scarlet hue. He leaned forward so that he could see directly into the light. He felt a wave of negative emotions wash over him. It felt like he was being examined under some sort of giant microscope. He looked away from the light and told his friend to drive, who quickly snapped out of his trance and started driving. As they got further down the road, he realized the red light wasn't fading and the interior of the car was bathed in red. He turned around and saw that to his horror, the light was following them. It then veered off into some trees. His friend stopped the car again, stared at the light and said he was going to follow it. He told his friend that they had to leave, which seemed to snap him out of it. They left, and after discussing it with some friends, they are now convinced the light was not from Earth and that something had been done to them. Coming in at number 9 now, we have the truth. One Reddit user told a story about her mum. Her mum had a friend called Lisa. When they were both teenagers, they were on the roof of Lisa's house one night when they saw a bright light in the sky. Suddenly, the light was gone. When they checked the time, they were shocked to see that instead of 15 minutes passing, they'd apparently been there for 3 hours. A few months later, she moved house and lost contact with Lisa for 10 years. When they finally met up again, she noticed something was strange about Lisa. Lisa seemed distant, dreamy, peaceful, but for no obvious reason. The conversation turned to that night on the roof all those years ago. Lisa said she now remembered everything that happened. At first she was confused and scared, but the memory eventually returned clearly. She said that aliens abducted them and that it had happened to her at least 3 times after. At first, the aliens had paralyzed her and did invasive experiments on her. On the most recent abduction though, they didn't probe her, they just talked to her instead. She said they didn't speak English, but could understand everything she said. They told her secrets about space, Earth, and predictions about her own life, which actually came true later on. Lisa said that every time she speaks with them, she comes closer to the truth, and that once someone knows the truth, everything will become wonderful. Next up at number 8 now, we have the brain drain. This one comes from a Reddit user called Girl Named Riley. She said that when she was in the 6th grade, she woke up with 4 very small holes on her upper right thigh. It looked like the skin had been cut out in perfect tiny circles, yet there was no blood. The circles were in a straight line and across her thigh horizontally. They were no more than 6 inches wide. She also felt very tired and couldn't remember what she had dreamt the night before. This was weird for her because she usually remembered every dream she had. She patched up the holes and went to school like normal that day. The next morning, she woke up to find 3 new holes right above the previous 4. She was tired again and was weirded out by how perfectly symmetrical the holes were. Her mum brushed it off as probably just spider bites or something. The next morning, there were 2 more bites above the others. The next morning, just 1. It was at that point she realized they had formed a perfect triangle. That night, she was too scared to go to bed, but woke up not remembering falling asleep. She threw off the blanket and found that the holes had completely gone. There were no scabs or scarring. Her mum said they must have just healed. Here's the weirdest part. She said that after this, she lost her ability to work with numbers. She'd always excelled in maths all her life, but after this incident, it was like numbers had no meaning and she couldn't figure out simple equations. To this day, she can't even do simple addition without having to check it multiple times. The only adding up that she's confident with is that this all adds up to some sort of alien abduction. What do you guys think? Is there perhaps a rational explanation for all this? Moving on to number 7 now, we have the time slip. This one comes from Reddit user Punchi. He said he remembers one hot summer night as a kid when he was sitting on his bed and he had a bad feeling. It was more than just a feeling though. He knew something was coming to get him. It felt like a horrifying recurrence was about to happen again, one that his body remembered but his mind did not. He knew it was close as well. The thing that was coming for him might even see him already. He was terrified beyond his wits, but he didn't even know why. That actually scared him even more. There was nothing he could do to stop it. He sat there on his bed for a few moments while these thoughts ran through his head. He turned around slowly to scan his room, and then suddenly it was the next morning. Just like that, it had gone from night to morning in a second. He was still fully dressed. He felt well rested despite only a second passing, a second he had actually been awake for. He went downstairs and got on with his day. He told his family and friends what happened, and they just acted like it was nothing and brushed the whole thing off. He couldn't though, and in the years since then he's become convinced that his body knew best. He had been abducted by aliens, and it wasn't the first time either. Next up at number 6 now, we have Betty and Barney. This is a very famous case from the 60s. Betty and Barney Hill were a couple returning from a trip to Canada to their home in New Hampshire. As they drove through the remote White Mountains, Betty noticed a star that seemed to be following their car. Barney pulled the car over and looked at the light through some binoculars. He said he saw red, amber and green flashing lights. As they got closer, they reported seeing bipedal humanoid creatures looking out of the window. Panicked, he jumped back in the car and started speeding down the road. When they got home, they realized the journey had taken 2 hours longer than expected. They couldn't remember what happened during those 2 hours. Within days of their sighting, Betty began having nightmares involving her being taken aboard this flying saucer and then being medically examined. Through therapy, they began to remember more details of their supposed abduction. You guys can actually find the tapes of these very therapy sessions online, and they're pretty creepy to listen to, I won't lie. If you're interested in this kind of stuff though, I highly recommend looking them up. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the false memory. This one comes from Reddit user Curtis187. He said that one night as a kid, he went down to get a drink of water from his kitchen at about 4 in the morning. As he filled up his glass, he heard a low-pitched buzzing sound coming from outside. He went out to his backyard and looked up to see, in his own words, a bright round object hovering about 600 feet above him. He froze there. It was almost like he was paralyzed for a moment. He watched as it ascended higher into the air and then took off at an incredible speed before disappearing into the clouds. That night, he had a dream that he had been abducted by aliens. In the years since then, he always wondered if the dream was what actually happened, but it was just made to seem like it was a dream. Next up at number 4 now, we have the tent poles. This one comes from Reddit, where a user shared a story from their father-in-law. He said he was once camping in the northern Appalachian Mountains with about 4 other people. They hiked up near a lake and set up a campsite. He said they all remember swimming and then eating dinner, but no one remembers cleaning up the camp or even going into their tents. They woke up about 10 yards away from their original site. Everything seemed to have just shifted 10 yards. They thought they were imagining it at first, but when they looked 10 yards away, they found tent peg holes from where their tents originally were. They weren't imagining it, their tents really had moved, and it was about to get creepier. They grabbed a measuring tape and measured the distance between the holes. For every single tent, the distance was exactly the same, right down to the inch. To this day, the father-in-law refuses to hike that trail, and many people tell him he was abducted by careless aliens who didn't put their camp back exactly where they found it. At number 3 now, guys, we have the lights. This one comes from Nerdy by Nature. She said that she was once camping in northern Georgia with some friends. It started to rain, so everyone left their tents and decided to rent one of the on-site cabins. She decided to just sleep in her car because the others wanted to stay up late. She woke up to the rain at 3 a.m. It was cold, and so she trekked over to her tent. It was the last one in the row, and she had to go past everyone else's to get there. After 10 minutes of trying to get to sleep, she began to hear whispers outside the tent door. They weren't in English, and to her recollection, were not in any language that she recognized. Just as the 2 voices started, 2 orbs appeared together outside the tent. They began floating around the tent as the whispers grew louder. As the orbs circled the tent, she noticed there weren't any footsteps. She huddled herself up and was the most terrified she had ever been. She closed her eyes, the light swirled faster, the voices grew louder, her mind raced, and she began sweating despite the cold. And then, just like that, the lights shut off. The whispers stopped, and there was nothing but silence in the woods around her. She waited till dawn before stepping out of her tent. She shared her story because she was convinced that she was visited by or abducted by aliens that very night. Next up at number 2 now, we have the owl. This one comes from Reddit user Mikey Shikari. He said that when he was 13 years old, he believed extraterrestrial beings were following him around. He used to have sudden urges to go outside in the middle of the night and just look up at the stars. Often he would see triangular shaped aircraft hovering over him and then just disappear. The house he lived in seemed to be haunted because he heard voices and saw non-human shaped shadows through the corner of his eye. The creepiest part was that when he would go places, an owl would always seem to be following him around. Everywhere he went, the same owl would be within his surroundings. The owl would also let him get close to it, but it was always a few feet too high for him to actually touch. This lasted about 6 months, but the worst was yet to come. One night he was in bed but fully awake and scared because he felt like he was surrounded by a group of people even though he couldn't see anyone. They were speaking in whispers and he couldn't make out what they were saying. Then he remembered being lifted up and thrown down onto his bed. He was in a state of panic and then looked at the door to see his dad stood there in shock in the doorway holding his gun. He said he heard noises and that when he opened the bedroom door, he saw his son floating above the bed, so he ran and grabbed his gun. After that night, the owl and the feeling of being watched over ended forever. And finally, at number 1 now, we have loss of hearing. This one comes from Reddit user Negative Caps. In 1997, when he was 8 years old, he was playing in the sand volleyball court at the park near his home in Colorado Springs. He was engrossed in his activity, burying his collection of Happy Meal toys in the sand and then digging them out to do it all over again, you know, kid stuff. He looked down but suddenly decided that he needed to look up because, well, the whole world around him had suddenly lost all sound. There was nothing. No ambient noises, no traffic noises from the busy streets nearby, no dogs barking, no birds chirping, nothing. He looked at the street nearby and that's when he saw it. A craft that looked like a stealth bomber turned sideways. It was completely shiny black in color, as tall as a house and shaped like an arrowhead. It was gliding down the road slowly. He watched it for 20 seconds. As soon as it passed behind some houses and out of sight, he got his hearing back in full force. To this day, he is convinced that he had been abducted or probed by the aliens in that craft, and the hearing loss was an unfortunate side effect. Well, those were the stories, guys. Did that convince any of you? For those of you that already believe in alien abductions, did this just reaffirm your belief? I'm not really sure if it's convinced me yet. Maybe we can talk about this in the comments. I'm probably asking for an abduction right now, aren't I? Either way, thanks for watching as always, guys. My name is Danny Burke, and I will see you all in the next video.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. It's about facts from history that they won't teach you in school. Schools refuse to teach anyone about these moments from history, so we're going to show you what schools won't. Click the video now to find out more.